we use textbooks as references, but we really try to rely on stories to teach the big events and stories to teach about the cultures. So it's a lot more work, but it's a lot more rewarding. And we found that our students, the events stick with them more.
In a recent letter, Pope Francis discussed the role of literature in the formation of the human person. He described reading novels and poems as part of one's path to personal maturity, and not merely a form of entertainment. When we read, he tells us, we are able to renew and expand our worldview. When we look down at a book, we are better able to look up to God and look out to the real situation of our neighbors. In many cases, a novel may evoke memories of our own past experiences, or it may help us make sense of the joys and sorrows we face in the present. A good story invites our engagement in such a way that we find ourselves within it. As Pope Francis says, readers, in some sense, rewrite a text, enlarging its scope through their imagination. But the reader's imagination may not catch fire without the well-formed imagination of the author at work to fuel it. The author of a coming-of-age story, for example, must have a particular gift for understanding the young person's mind and heart. The author of a piece of historical fiction must have a firm grasp on the facts of the past and also have questions about a particular era, event, or movement that is relevant in his or her own time. Abigail Palmer has written a debut novel for Ignatius Press that succeeds both as a coming-of-age tale and as historical fiction. It is powerful fuel to fire the Christian imagination. The book is called Faelan and the Miracle Machines. It is written for readers age 10 and up, and it will certainly resonate well with younger readers, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and adults will learn a lot from it. The novel chronicles a fictional youth named Faelan who lives amid the real people of ancient Britain at the time of the Roman Empire. After experiencing a tragedy in his family and tribe, Faelan's lot worsens further by being sold into the service of a cruel Roman aristocrat. His circumstances, however, eventually take him to the great city of Alexandria, where the world opens up for him in ways he could never have imagined. Although neither Faelan nor most of the other characters in the book are Christians, the setting is just after the time of Christ, and the church is growing. The happy specter of Christendom looms in the future of the complex civilization Abigail Palmer shows us. Abigail Palmer holds a BA in Classics from the University of Dallas and an MA in Classics from Fordham University. She lives with her husband and family in the Bay Area of Northern California, where she translates, teaches Latin and history, and writes. Raised in Colorado and Montana, Abigail is always trying to get back to the mountains. In Faelan and the Miracle Machines, she takes us on quite a journey to the ancient world and into the human heart. It is my pleasure to welcome Abigail Palmer to the Ignatius Press podcast. Abigail Palmer, welcome to the Ignatius Press podcast. How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you, Andrew?
I'm very well, and all the better because I read your really enjoyable novel that we are going to discuss today. The novel is called Faelan and the Miracle Machines. And I told you in advance of our conversation, this is kind of a treat for me because a lot of the conversations I have, they're wonderful, but they're about nonfiction books or theological works.
Mm-hmm.
And only occasionally I get to do a fiction book. So this was really, really fun. Now, Abigail, this is your debut novel, and it obviously contains, for those who read it, they'll notice right away, a lot of knowledge of the ancient world, classical languages, all kinds of stuff like that. So I wonder if you could tell us kind of what led you to, tell us a little bit about yourself and also what led you to write this novel.
Sure. Yeah. So I've always been interested in the ancient world. Started studying Latin in high school and then went to University of Dallas and majored in classics, so Latin and Greek language, and went to grad school and got a master's in it as well. And at that point, I'd been teaching in between, and at that point, wrote some curriculum. For the ancient world, ancient Greek and Roman history, and then have been teaching ever since. And I noticed that, well, I noticed a few things. As far as history teaching goes, I found that a lot of people don't like history when they study it. It's boring. And then, oftentimes, they come back to it as an adult, and they get into, like, World War II history, and they read these humongous books about World War II, or Civil War history, and they read these humongous books about the Civil War. But I think a lot of people are lost forever to it, like, history is boring, right? And then they can't glean any lessons from it because it was like, "Well, good thing that's done," right? So I kind of developed with my co-teacher who teaches modern history at the school where I work at, a kind of history is story program where we use textbooks as references, but we really try to rely on stories to teach the big events and stories to teach about the cultures. So, for example, I'll start and our classes are, we call them like integrated humanities, where you've got the humanities, so art and literature, kind of worked in with the history. Um, and so, like my Greek humanities class, we'll start out with Nathaniel Hawthorne's version of Bacchus and Philemon. I think it's called The Miraculous Pitcher, is his name. So you are starting the class with, once there were um, an old man and an old woman, and they lived, so you're starting the class out that way. It's a lot more work as a teacher. It's much easier to pull out a textbook and go like, all right, everyone, going to do these two chapters this week and the next two chapters the next week, and you're going to have questions to answer. And it's something that takes some commitment because you have to um, keep improving it every time you teach the course. So you say, okay, well, you know the assassination of Julius Caesar, it's still, I'm still not there yet, teaching it in a living way, or teaching it in a really engaging way, so I'm going to have to refine that the next time around, things like that. um, so it's a lot more work, but it's a lot more rewarding. And we found that our students, the events stick with them more. So there were certain stories that my students really enjoyed, I noticed. And I teach 7th grade through 12th grade, I should say. The 7th and 8th graders, it was stories from history, like about Hannibal crossing the Alps with the elephants. They just wrote, like, that's crazy. That didn't happen. Another one was Queen Boudica in Britain. Her rebellion against the Romans. And students really interested in this. They're generally really interested in people who take on the Romans because they admire the Romans, but they see the problems there, right? I
Mhm.
think a great place for us to be in as we study ancient history is to not just kind of accept everything that the different cultures present us with, you know, um, but to say, like, well, where was there injustice? Where was there oppression? It's okay to say that. The
Mhm.
Romans, they're not all saints. There were Roman saints, but there were big problems. So I've noticed that students are really interested in who resisted the Romans. Spartacus, like, oh, like, and he was a gladiator, so that helps too. But so I had this story of Boudica in mind. I thought, boy, make a great, great, compelling young adult fiction, historical fiction. I mean, maybe there's a boy who is there at the battle because the Celts and the Britons or Celts, they had this practice when they'd have a really big battle, they'd have all the women and children come with the wagons and carts and watch the battle. It's kind of like in the Civil War. You hear about those battles where they would do that. You think that's awful, but it kept happening up until modern times. It was a really bad idea in this one particular battle because the Celts all, for once, united to fight against the Romans, to expel them from Britain was the idea. And it didn't go that way at all. The Celts weren't used to fighting together. They had their own leaders, each tribe. They didn't always get along. And the Romans are this elite fighting force, right? That they were eliminated pretty quickly. They lost the battle pretty soundly. Queen Boudica took poison instead of be taken prisoner. And it's out of that story that I thought of this boy, Faelan, who would survive that battle but be enslaved afterwards, which was the fate of people who weren't killed at that battle. And then, so I looked at the year. So that's 61 AD. We have my main Roman historian for that event was Tacitus. And so I look at the year and I think, well, what else is going on? Because the other person that my students have been interested in for a long time is Heron of Alexandria, who was, they would call him a philosopher. We have like a really specific idea of a philosopher. In the ancient world, it was more, they had a more open-minded view of philosophy. So he was, we would say, an inventor, studied mathematics, and the motion of elements, we could say. So how to harness earth, wind, fire, water, to make machines move. Most people I've learned don't know that outside of Archimedes, people do know about him somewhat, don't know there are all kinds of inventors, philosophers, who are doing these kinds of experiments and making these machines in the ancient world. They think of our era as the machine era. And there's a long history of humans making machines, interacting with machines. So I thought, well, wait, Heron is in Alexandria, which is a really interesting city, an interesting non-Roman city, eventually conquered by the Romans. So his lifetime happens the same time as that battle in Britain, even though they're the opposite ends of the Roman Empire. Could I make a story where I get to weave in both? And that was the beginning of Heron and the Miracle Machines. Faelan and the Miracle Machines, where Faelan is enslaved, taken by his master to Alexandria. He's going there on business, and then manages to escape once he gets there. So yeah, that was the kind of the roots of it.
Yeah, and Abigail, a third element that will stand out probably to our readers is, you set the story. These figures lived during the 1st century AD, very shortly after the time of Christ. So this is the time when the church is being born, and yet your main focus is on these characters who are not Christians, at least not yet, and they're sort of they find themselves ultimately, and we don't want to jump ahead too far, but kind of interacting in this milieu where where there's this exploration of the faith, where Alexandria ultimately becomes a great Christian city too, right? So I thought that was your choice there to kind of focus on these non-Christian figures of that same time was really interesting from the perspective now looking back all these centuries on what would become in the decades and centuries that followed.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, his Faelan, so his religion, Christianity is I probably totally unknown in Britain in 60 AD. I don't think anyone was there yet. They're all following the Druid religion, and they have Druids, and so he's coming from a pretty much totally non-Christian world still, into a world that Christianity has been there almost from the beginning. So you have the Apostle Mark is his territory, as far as where the different apostles go after Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. He's in Alexandria. And so it's an instant impact on that population there. I think in the 1st century, a lot of people are trying to find answers. They're looking for it in philosophy. If they're pagans, it's kind of a not so hidden secret at that point that paganism is kind of lame as a real religion. You have people like Cicero, even before Christ, saying it's not much help. You have to, of course, there's a feeling that for pagan religion, state ceremonies have to be honored. It's important. The Romans won't lose that idea of pietas, where you have to render to the gods what's due to them. So Roman religion is important, but it's like in a state religion way. You don't see so many people having a personal relationship with Jupiter, right?
Right.
Or it goes very badly. Most people would not recommend it. So they are gods who don't help you. They're gods who you can't have a relationship with on a personal level. It's the official state religion. You're going to support it and follow it. But in your private life, you're going to be trying to find answers to questions like, what is the purpose of life? Is there anything after this life? What's a way to live an ethical life? Because the gods also don't give you much help there either. So, this is kind of a world that's ripe for new ideas. And if you are actually open to trying to find solutions to these problems, you're going to encounter Christianity. And not only is it radical in that it's giving you a God who loves you as a person and you can actually have a relationship with, and it gives a view of the afterlife that's far superior to what's offered in paganism. There isn't just a Hades where you're a shade and a shadow and you're kind of hanging out there, not damned, but not hopeful either. So, in pagan Roman religion, there's this idea that when your relatives die, they go down to Hades. If they were just a normal person, not a war hero and not a terrible, terrible person, and they're unhappy, and you have to keep giving them offerings. So at the grave, there'll be a place where you can pour wine or you can leave beans or some kind of food offering. If you don't, people's spirits can come back and they can hurt you and they can haunt you. So there's definitely an idea of ghosts in Roman religion, and they're very superstitious, and they believe these ghosts can even hurt you. They can harm you if they're that unhappy, because the afterlife is that unrewarding. So you get this religion where there's a God who loves you and knows you yourself, and you can go somewhere vastly superior to this world or to pagan Hades, and that everyone is called. It's pretty crazy. This isn't a religion of just elites, right? This is a religion for all people, and you don't see that often.
Mm-hmm.
Slaves, we talked about before, slaves converting, because here's a place where you can have what everyone else has, right? Nothing is being held back from you. You have, as far as Roman women go, here's a religion that's rewarding, loves you for you, right? A God who loves you for you as well. And yeah, I think we kind of forget what a big deal that is, to have a religion come in the world where, especially the outcasts, they're almost called first, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think of that parable of the banquet. They go out in the streets and get all this people who, the ones who are invited wouldn't come. So everyone else gets to come.
Yeah, and I believe, Abigail, one of the characters in your novel actually says something like, Christianity often comes into a family through the slaves, or something like that. Like, it's actually the kind of the lowest people in the society that then are actually able to kind of evangelize the great and the good, maybe to varying degrees of success. But in your book, you do show, not to give things away, but there's some success there. It seems, in terms of that, the lower ranked people in society kind of having an effect with their faith on people above them.
Yeah, because I mean, and you see how everything can work, even awful institutions can work towards some kind of good, and that slavery is this terrible terrible institution that I think it's haunted us. I mean, since the beginning of civilizations. But in this case, you had slaves who I mean, they're deprived of their will in every case. They are in no way able to change their lot on their own. But regardless, they have a presence in a household. Um, Sometimes they have a presence of instructing the young in a household. So they're teaching. And it's one of the difficulties of slavery is, of course, they're humans. Slaves are humans. They're listed on property lists with cattle and donkeys and pigs. But at the same time, of course, they're humans and they have this influence in Roman households. So, the pagan Romans are trying to justify this by saying, well, okay, don't let your children get too close to the children of your slaves because, that's tricky, right?
Hmm.
That's a situation you don't want to get into. But of course, it's bound to happen, that as slaves grow up together with children and children, they might begin to view them too much like humans, right?
Hmm.
And become too soft towards them. So the Romans trying to justify how to be a master of slaves, um, and not treat them too humanely, humanely enough, I'll say. So yeah, you have slaves who are outside the home being exposed to Christianity through other slaves. They're bringing it to the household. They're around the children and the lady of the house, and they're spreading this good news. Um, all the things that we've already talked about,
Hmm.
of an afterlife that's rewarding, of a God who loves you, of love for all. Imagine as a slave what that would mean, that someone loves you for you, that he has called you, um,
Hmm.
and spreading through the household in this way. Now, whether the Roman master of the house, the father, the paterfamilias, what he's going to say about all of this that's the tricky thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the mothers of the household too, though that's really their domain. So a Roman lady, her house, managing all the household finances, managing conflicts between slaves. It's a big task depending on how wealthy a family is.
Hmm.
Um, so she has a role and she has a voice, but still the father is the head of the whole household, has the power of life and death over the entire household. Um, and as wonderful as the message of Christianity is, it's also really challenging too.
Hmm.
If you're a Roman, um, you see this in Tacitus, where it's this great, in Tacitus, he has a description of Christianity and Jesus. And if you've never read it, I'd recommend you find it, just look it up. Where he says that there's this failed revolutionary. It says at this time, there's this failed revolutionary. So for the Romans, earthly success is huge, right?
Hmm.
Um, and they don't really want to deal extensively with the situation in Judea. The Romans, it's a big pain, right? Judea is a big pain. There are zealots who are Jewish. There are revolutionary forces within Judaism. There's Jews who are collaborating with the Romans, and and in this, Jesus Christ emerges, and they're not going to give him a second look at first. It's like, oh gosh, more trouble, more
Hmm.
trouble. But in this case, he was a failed revolutionary, and his followers were just, um, by Tacitus, you can see in his tone, they're just the worst. They're I'm trying to remember the exact phrase he uses for Christians. They're despicable. Um, and so early on, the official response is, it's a failed attempt at revolution. There's no earthly glory in this. Um, they refuse to get along, because that's an element in my book too. It's
Hmm.
something that early Christians and Jews had in common, that the Romans, wherever they went, they just kind of folded in gods. They were okay with this. They already had a polytheistic world. And as I said, having a personal relationship with these gods, I don't think is so important. It's more about public worship and trying to gain some kind of advantage. So praying for things, praying that disaster doesn't happen. And so when the Romans take over Egypt and they add Alexandria to the empire, they just add in all the Egyptian gods. They're fine with that. You can have Isis and you can have Neptune. There's a new made-up god, Serapis. He has all the hallmarks of a new god. We'll add him in too. And just worship all of them. So Christians and Jews refuse to do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to do this. There's no way. And the Romans view this as causing problems, refusing to get along. Everyone else is getting along, right? What's wrong with you? So you might be compelled, if someone thinks you're a Christian, you might be compelled to burn some incense to Jupiter. Or because at this point they've also started making their emperors into gods, burn some incense to the divine Augustus. Just do it. No big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And if you refuse, then, arrest can happen and execution.
Mm-hmm.
So those are challenges to Christianity, and challenges that the Romans are feeling. They're not sure how bad this movement is going to get, right? And they feel that they've already had a lot to deal with the Jews, who also, and first, I believe Christianity is viewed as a kind of Judaism. Mm-hmm. It seems, from what I read, they don't really see a difference between the two. The Romans don't. And then the final blow that pagans have a really hard time with Christianity is the idea of a resurrection. Mm-hmm. Like, why? A lot of pagan philosophy, not all of it, but a lot of it is about escaping the body. Like the body is this prison and it keeps you here. And, the best thing that can happen is you escape it. You're able to finally be free of it someday. To hear that it will come back and you will be reunited with it, mm-hmm. It's like, why? Mm-hmm. Why would you do that? They can't accept that at all. Yeah. So
yeah, and it's very interesting how in the characters you have there's a Jewish character, kind of a prominent Jewish character in the book, and then also some Christian characters, and I really enjoy the way that you sort of show in these characters how all of this plays out in this kind of turning point time there in the first century. I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about Faelan. Mm-hmm. I love what you do with him, in terms of his kind of historical background, the son of these people who get slaughtered by the Romans, and he gets enslaved. In addition to it being, though, a really great historical novel, it's a great kind of coming of age story. And, I think for that reason, young people will really enjoy reading it. I enjoyed reading it. I love coming of age movies and novels and stuff like that. Were there particular inspirations you had in your mind, like other kinds of coming of age tales or something that you were thinking of when you constructed the character of Faelan?
That's a great question. And I like that. It is a coming of age story, right? I think I'm writing the second one now, and it's going to be even more so, right? Mm-hmm. He's left in this situation, and how is he going to become a man, right? In the place where he's at. As far as inspiration, it's totally different world. I mean, literally a totally different world, but I really like Lloyd Alexander. The way he writes characters, not just the way he develops characters. I really like his language too. The way he writes for children by not writing for children, right? Yeah. I mean, you can read all of his books out loud. I think of one that we enjoyed that I don't know if everyone reads is the book Time Cat. So it's like time travel, different eras, but it's this boy who is he's kind of plunged into these situations. Some are more dangerous than others in history. So he meets St. Patrick in Ireland, but it's this dangerous situation where the king, who is not a Christian, is, threatening, not threatening, sometimes threatening St. Patrick. And St. Patrick has to prove himself against the court astrologer. I don't
Hmm.
know if you've ever read this book, but
No.
there were just some great lines in there where, St. Patrick says things like, well, the astrologer, I'm sure he would have made an excellent philosopher. And it's a shame he had to give himself over to this irrational pursuit, when there's so much more out there that is true. And, it was lines like that they seem to be written for children, right? But as
Hmm.
you read it, you say, well, that was really well expressed. How sad that this man of great intelligence has given himself over to astrology and just being a court astrologer. And he could have been so much more. And so that was one inspiration, the way that um, he writes his characters and develops his characters. Um, I um, I also just took inspiration from kind of observation of adolescence. So I mean, Phelan's not perfect. I think
Hmm.
if you're a 13-year-old, you're impulsive. You don't think. You make decisions, right? But he wants good, and he wants to do what's good. He wants to be able to still trust people despite having a master who is a horrible person.
Hmm.
Um, and so I feel privileged that I know a lot of adolescents, and
Hmm.
um this is they're up for adventures. Sometimes the adventures go wrong.
Hmm.
Sometimes they think, oh, I shouldn't have done that, or oh, I didn't think that through. And that was kind of, as I was writing Phelan, I was thinking of adolescents I knew. So he received some really bad news at one point in the story, and it's a shock to him, and his first instinct is to run and help, and he
Hmm.
doesn't help. It's not helpful. The people who've made this plan around him are like, what are you doing?
Hmm.
We had a plan. But he's full of love, and he wants to do right, and he wants to right injustice. And
Yeah.
that's a wonderful adolescent quality, that you see injustice and you're not okay with it. You want to fix it. I think it gets kind of taken out of us over the years as we become adults. So yeah.
Yeah, that really comes through everything that you've said there with Phelan. I also I couldn't help but sort of think of Charles Dickens a little bit. I kind of there's a little bit of a quality where he's this precocious feisty young man who's who has to serve this horrible, almost caricature of a cruel master, and it's just it's so gripping. I mean, it really is. I just
Oh,
thought it was
thank
just
you.
very well constructed how you did that and how you depict his journey. And yeah, as you say, I also spend a lot of time around younger people, and it was a really accurate depiction, I think, of the way somebody would act in that way. And I really hope that when young people read the book and find some affinity with Phelan, they'll also remember that, in a sense, we think of like olden times and what, we sort of separate it from the kind of reality that we live in today. But, kids were kids in the past, just like they are now. And
Yes.
Phelan's in this really weird, awful situation that no one would want to be in. But I mean, the way he navigates it is not totally dissimilar from the way we can imagine our own children in our own day kind of making sense of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, that was definitely a goal. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about Heron too, because yeah, as you mentioned before, so he's based on a real historical person who
Hmm.
was a philosopher, inventor, and as is indicated in the title of the book, he creates these miracle machines. And so I really enjoyed how you wove into the story kind of scientific inquiry and innovation and that kind of thing, but it's, as you say, kind of grounded in a different reality than what we would think of today. Like it really is kind of part and parcel of a philosophical life, like
Hmm.
that things are created for some sort of more humane, holistic purpose. Like, I don't know, just where did it come from, that character? And I mean, did you research him and his specific inventions, or was that just kind of from your mind where you thought of the kinds of things he might have come up with?
Sure. No, I researched him. Yeah.
Hmm.
I wish I could come up with Phelan. He's amazing. I mean, with Phelan, with Heron, he's amazing. I think Archimedes is an inspiration that I learned of
Hmm.
before that. And there's that great young adult book. Well, I mean, it's probably like ages 8 and up, not just young adult. Archimedes and the Door of Science, I believe it is. Jeannie Bendick is the author. It's short. It's not long at all. It's great if someone wants to research Archimedes, you read that book. He's also mentioned in the Roman historian Livy. So So Archimedes, Heron, these were real philosophers. Their primary goals were philosophical. So advances in mathematics, advances in what we would call physics, right? But as a side product, they make these machines, sometimes to test out theories of how fire, water, and air can work together. Um, for all of Heron's machines he made, he had to do the math. We have a few manuscripts of his work. A lot of what he wrote is lost, but we do have some things. And he talks about how to actually make these machines. So he's a Greek from Alexandria. Um, and in these Greek manuscripts, he talks about, for example, how to make an automatic theater, how to make a vending machine, what we would call a vending machine. You put money in and it dispenses a certain amount of water. This is what they used in pagan temples. So he's making these things. They're being bought. He makes war machines for the Romans. But his primary goal is mathematics and the physical sciences. He lived, we're not sure if he lived at the Museon. Some did live at the Museon in Alexandria, but at any rate, he worked at the Museon and the library in Alexandria. So imagine he had a workshop, he was building these machines, he was testing them, and he was writing down his results. There's a theory too that he was kind of he would have been a theater person if he had a chance, because he makes all these machines that are meant for the theater. So like the automatic theater, it would wheel out. You'd wheel it out. You'd actually wheel this one out. Some of his machines wheel out on the stage by themselves using gravity and a ramp, and then they wheel back when they're done. But this one, it's like a temple on a pedestal. And he wrote in his manuscript, it's really important that the pedestal be really narrow so that people understand that there can't be a human inside it, or anyone or a child working this machine. So, he's got like the optics of how the machines work, and the automatic theater, you'd pull a string or click a lever, I don't remember which, and the doors would automatically open and a whole story would play out. The story of Nauplius is the one that he has in his manuscript. There'd be sound effects. So sound effects were important for Heron. When thunder, there's a storm and the ship is going to sink, he would have, little balls released onto a drum skin. And this is all happening in this box, in this temple-shaped box. So in the process of making that theater machine, he actually invents what is considered the first computer program. The whole thing works by dowels with rope wound around them, and then pegs in the dowels. So everything moves as the dowel unwinds. When it hits that peg, it's like a new command, and a new scene in the story would begin. So it's a computer program. And so for him, it's like the entertainment is wrapped up in the science, right? But it's all a byproduct of his philosophical studies. So as I said earlier, they didn't have these categories of the humanities that we have now. So if you go to a university and there's the science building, it's literally away from the humanities building, and they're in different places. And then in that building, the different departments, you can't get to the departments through interior doors, literally, right? In the ancient world, that didn't exist at all. So you'd have philosophers who are interested in anatomy, in astronomy, in philosophy. They would be familiar with Homer, familiar with tragedies. They might not choose to specialize in them, but they had a knowledge of them. So there weren't these artificial doors and these buildings separating them, and there weren't really limits on that knowledge. They were really free to pursue, whatever a human mind can learn and understand. So yeah, we don't know a lot about Heron's personal life. We know he lived in the 1st century. We don't know, anything about his family, that
Mhm.
information's lost. But what we do have is pretty inspiring when we look back on it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I enjoyed the idea that now when we meet him, he teaches kind of the great and the good of Alexandria. Young people come to him for tuition, whether it's a kind of a boy from a well-to-do Jewish family or a son of a Roman, a high-level Roman public servant or whatever it may be. But then he also sees no problem with taking on this slave boy who comes to him from this faraway land, and he sees in all of these young people around him the opportunity to teach and to inspire. And I thought that was a neat part of his character, that he seems to be a kind of a true intellectual in that way, that he's very curious and also is happy to see other people inspired in the same way.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. And I would like to hope he was like that, right? I mean, this is
Yeah.
the fiction part of historical fiction. There's a point where he has to make a choice
Hmm.
because this boy ends up in his life. He should turn him in. He should turn him into the authorities. He's a runaway slave. If you harbored a runaway slave, especially if you weren't a citizen, I'm not sure. Maybe even if you were a citizen, but anyway, if you harbored a runaway slave, knowing they're a runaway slave, the death penalty could be the consequence. So
Hmm.
he knows the stakes are high. He knows that because of the circumstances, which I don't want to give away, that this boy is probably a runaway slave from a very wealthy person,
Hmm.
probably a powerful person, and he has a conversation with one of his friends who's a physician, and the physician says, like, if you don't help him, he's going to die.
Hmm.
Like, he's been so neglected. He's got a severe concussion. These are the facts. And so Heron has to choose. It's a point where not many people have helped Faelan up to this point. He's had adults in his life, in the fellow slaves in the household, who have been kind of hands off. They've seen this all play out before with other slaves. They themselves don't want to be beaten. There's a point where one of the slaves makes a decision to protect Faelan, and he suffers a physical consequence for it. So from the time he's been enslaved, he hasn't had a ton of help. Other slaves have been trying to avoid being hurt themselves.
Hmm.
So he needed someone at that point to take him in. And when Heron discovers that Faelan has this interest in machines, um, then yeah, he's willing to take him on, but it all has to be a secret, right?
Hmm.
And that's a challenge. Um, you know, how do you build friendships with people who don't know who you really are?
Hmm.
So that was, a kind of a continuing source of heartbreak as I'm writing it. And for Phelan, when does he get to tell his friends, I am not this, I'm not this person.
Hmm.
Um, my name is Phelan. I had a family,
Hmm.
right? My father was a chieftain. I had sisters and a mother. He has to hide all of that still from just a few people,
Hmm.
even by the end of the book. So we'll see in the second book. Maybe he's not going to hide anymore.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you what's next for Phelan, because again, not to give anything away, but it's obvious from our conversation that he makes it out of the book alive. So his adventure continues, his journey continues, and as you say, I was just struck by what you were saying about. It did occur to me a little bit, but all the more so now that you've said it, that for someone to be on the run and to have to pretend to be someone else, it comes at the cost, doesn't it, of kind of
Mhm.
deeper pain about the loss of the people, of the deeper pain about the people that you've lost, because he can't sort of, you know, he certainly can't speak openly about his lost loved ones or anything, but it's almost like kind of the memory of it even has to fade a little bit because of the persona that he has to put on in this world where he has to hide.
Sure, sure. I think he has a ritual where he tries to remember faces, right? When he's
Hmm.
going to sleep at night, trying to remember his mother's face, trying to remember his father's face. There's a point where a Jewish character becomes really upset about the way the Romans have treated the Jews and how they view them, and he can't hide it anymore, and he's crying, and Phelan, all he can do is sympathize with him. He can't say why, right? He can't
Hmm.
say like, oh yeah, you know, they destroyed my civilization.
Right.
Nothing exists because of them. He can't say that to him. All he can do is just put his arm around his friend and just be there with him. They've both suffered. Um, I had a friend say, um, you know, for being in classics, this is a kind of anti-Roman book. It's like, well, when you really think, I mean, it's easy for us. Slavery becomes part of a curriculum, unfortunately, right? I mean,
Right.
even when you study American slavery, and I think you don't want to. It can really get you down, but on the other hand, it should get you down. And when I really started to think about, um, you know, the i the idea of slavery, what it does to the human person, the potential of the human person, how it's completely trampled upon. Someone might have God-given skills and gifts. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because the will of another determines your whole life and your whole future.
Mhm.
Um, and when we think about ancient slavery, it's completely part of a curriculum to the point where people say, well, the Romans, the empire, it had its problems, but it brought peace. There were roads and indoor plumbing. I think this doesn't matter at all. If you're some slave who
Mhm.
had a civilization, who had a family in Greece or Britain or Egypt or Judea, and it's all gone. All the roads in the world aren't going to help you because you can't run away on them.
Mhm.
So trying to keep the injustice and the indignity of the slave state kind of fresh in people's minds. And once again, that I think there was a point you kind of see in the history of scholarship that it was just outright, admiration for the Romans. Um, they did all this, they gave us all this. They've given us a lot, but their civilization had some pretty large difficulties that
Mhm.
we can call out. It's fine. It's okay to do that, and you can take the good and look at the bad and say like, how do we avoid that bad, right?
Mhm.
Because we
Yeah.
also have our own blind spots that we can't see because we're too close to them. So in our own
Yeah.
civilization.
And I thought, to your point, there's a character in your book named Ezekiel who's from Ethiopia, and he's one of the few, I think, openly Christian characters in the book. And
Mhm.
I think the fact that he's from Ethiopia is it makes a really nice contrast. Like, it sort of shows the inherent dignity of the human being that is that's part and parcel of Christianity, that contrasts with the Roman way.
Mhm.
And we rejoice. I mean, not that Christianity is the dominant force in the world that it once was, maybe, but that ultimately Christianity is going to displace the Roman way, in a way, right?
Sure.
That's coming in future decades and centuries.
Yeah, I was watching a documentary, totally secular documentary on PBS, and it was talking about Constantine. And I thought, okay, like okay, let's see how this goes. And it was really good. It was saying that I think the exact phrase they used was in the in the in the in the contrast between paganism and Christianity, paganism didn't have a chance.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that was their conclusion. That um, there wasn't a way to stop the tide of Christianity spreading at all because
Hmm.
of the reasons we've already talked about. But it really couldn't compete. In the end, people make decisions based on what's appealing to them, and they're not going to stay in a religion that it offers no personal satisfaction. You know,
Hmm.
you'll take those same pagan values like pietas. So, pietas, the father of the household, gathering his whole family around him every morning of every day and making a sacrifice. It could be like a pomegranate, it could be a small animal or like a bird, but every day you made a sacrifice at the beginning of the day to the gods. Um, and we can admire that. We can say, wow, that's how you should start your day, right? Is by offering your household, but then you take it and it's turned into offering everything to God, offering
Hmm.
your families at the start of your day, saying, it's all yours. You gave it all to us, to a God who loves us and has our good in mind, and has something greater planned for us. So yeah, that's yeah, Ezekiel. He's I really enjoyed writing Ezekiel too. So here's someone who, and you see this in the modern world as well, English speakers who, you know, their preference is to speak English, though they maybe the way they came about it was through conquest, right? So there's a point where Ezekiel, he's trying to help Faelan write Latin. Faelan can speak Latin, but it's not the point in Roman Britain where the British chieftains youth are learning Latin like in a school setting. That's going to be in about 10 more years. About 70 AD, there's a real effort to make the Celts and the Romans kind of Romanize the Celts more. Faelan doesn't get that. He leaves Britain before then. But Ezekiel is helping Faelan in the library learn Latin, like learn to write Latin, right? It's a gift he gives him. Though neither of them, it's not their preferred first language or spoken language, but it's the language of the world they're in. And I just kind of, you see that echoed in empires down the ages, right? Where English becomes the language of empires, but then people do wonderful things with it once they've gotten it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Well, this is all wonderful stuff, Abigail, and I can't wait to read the next installment of Faelan's story. But in the meantime, I strongly recommend that all of our listeners and viewers go out and buy a copy of Faelan and the Miracle Machines for themselves, for their children, for their nieces, nephews, whoever it may be, and they won't be sorry. Again, the book is Faelan and the Miracle Machines, now available from Ignatius Press. You can buy your copy of this book wherever you get your books. And I loved reading it. So Abigail Palmer, thank you so much for writing it. And thank you so much for taking the time to join me today on the podcast.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate it. It was great talking with you.